All right, so I find this just unendingly fascinating. That I think one of the most intriguing and almost sci-fi medical therapies that have been suggested in the last several years has been microbe replacement therapy, right? So for certain kinds of infections and certain kinds of ailments, if you can effectively take the microbiome of a healthy individual and put them into a sick individual, then you can effect a complete change here. And this is sort of most famously done through fecal replacement therapy to treat Clostridium difficile. And so the question here is how exactly does that work? How do you actually create or facilitate a new community of bacteria or other organisms within the human host or within any other host? And what do we actually know about this? Is this something that we understand the mechanisms, or we just know that it's worked in the past so we can try it in the future, right? And what are some of the other examples of places where this has been tried?
We do know something of how bacteria will invade the gut area themselves, and oftentimes they have passengers with them, so they have tempered phages. And what happens is that the front end of the bacteria invading will lyse, releasing nasty substances.
And a phage here is a virus that specializes on bacteria, right?
So it's a co-evolved mutualism between the two. And so from this understanding, we know that bacteria can even move into an area which is populated and remove that community and then just move on and then populate themselves. So in some ways we understand the dynamics of this, and it's very similar to the dynamics about how invasive species will move into a habitat as well. So the ecology we understand. I guess the second point is that we, in many cases, don't understand how we might use it as a therapy. We just know that in some cases, like C. difficile, it works.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Mary, you were saying earlier that this is something there's a long history in veterinary medicine, right?
Certainly, cattle have rumens. Those are large fermentation vats that are full of bacteria, and if there becomes an imbalance, that often occurs if you change the feed rapidly. Then it changes the populations in the gut, and the cows can then not digest their food very well. And the classic therapy is what we call transvenation, is take the rumen content from a healthy cow and by stomach tube just insert it into the cow that's not doing well, and it just always works.
So animals are often recorded eating their own feces. People might have even noticed their dogs and cats do this quite a lot. And certainly with some of the predatory animals, that's not uncommon in the wild. Do you think they're actually develop this behavior to help themselves, to help this?
I think there's probably multiple answers to that, but one of them is yes.
And the other ones are maybe a no.
There may be some other reasons, and certainly there's
a nutritional
you probably
reason.
can talk to this better than I, but for specific nutrients and not necessarily the bacteria. But
Well, there is a really good example beyond the animals you're thinking of, which of course are termites, which have evolved a system of procodial feeding, where each member of the community, which maybe is 5 million individuals or something less, where individuals actually eat the feces of other individuals continuously, and in so doing share an assortment of protozoa throughout the colony, which have demonstrated benefits of protecting those termites from fungal infections and from bacterial infections. So the whole system is set up on this poop feeding, which is very effective, and it's a very useful way for them to combat disease.
So coprophagy is quite common in rabbits and hares, for
Yes.
example, but we've always assumed that is to do with increased ways of getting the nutrients out of the food. But in fact, there might be a second effect there.
Yeah.
So, and we've heard a lot about human therapies based on effectively coprophagy, right? I mean, fecal replacement therapy in the gut. But there are lots of parts of our bodies that are protected by a microbiome, right? We have microbiome in our skin, we have microbiome in our mouth, and there's been discussion of people with gingivitis having to replace the microbiome in their mouth following a bacterial treatment because they want to reseed that with a healthy microbiome, right? And Eric's work is focused on the microbiome of the upper respiratory tract. And so from your work, I mean, how far away do you think we are from an understanding that could allow us to use those kinds of therapies in the respiratory tract?
Yeah, so one of the reasons why I chose the respiratory tract is because it's relatively simple and relatively constant compared to the GI tract, which is, it's so dense I think people fail to understand how many bacteria are under there and how diverse it is from one region to another, and how much competition there is between bacteria. But if we can begin to understand those kinds of competitions and the ecosystems that are set up in a relatively simple system like the respiratory system, where there isn't changing food every day or as much, then maybe we can hope to understand them. But it's biology, it's complex.
Right.
But if I understand your work correctly, the microbiome in the respiratory tract is protecting the respiratory tract from the invasion of things that we would recognize as pathogens, things that would make us sick. So to what extent is the use of antibiotics, where we take drugs that are going to affect other bacteria in the body, to what extent is that making us vulnerable to further infections down the road?
Yeah, so it's certainly true that the respiratory microbiota affect our susceptibility to some, but we don't know. It may protect us against some, it probably does. It may facilitate infection by others, and so again, that's going to be very complex, and it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, and so that's a great question. And
But is it possible that frequent antibiotic users, for example, would be more prone to respiratory infections?
That's certainly possible, and I would suggest it would be particular respiratory infections, not respiratory infections in general, but particular types.
I'd ask a related question, if I may. Is there something that communities do in order to promote a positive microbiome, which is absent from what the medical establishment might do? I mean, have we seen this in history, that people would in some way, obviously a good healthy diet, one might imagine, would promote better gut flora. Have people done that in any way in the nasal area?
Are you talking about kissing?
Not kissing, no, no, not at all.
Penn State professor advocates kissing.
No, our children were born in Denmark, and there was a lot of, with all kids with bacterial diseases of the upper respiratory tract, and their solution was simply to go out into the cold a lot, because it had some physical changes which would condense the mucus, was the logic, and it's a country where it has the lowest prescription of antibiotics anywhere in the developed world, and it's maybe I'm just wondering if there's some tried and tested or
Tested, not that I'm aware of it, but certainly different cultures have dramatically different approaches to different more social mores about
Yes, I know.
So how those affect what's resident
And what's fascinating, in Asia, people have very different mucal components. I mean, there's a genetic difference in the mucus production in Asia, and the ear and the nose, compared to people from Europe, which is fascinating.
I would expect that it changes with humidity and potentially with season. And,
Yeah.